Hi, thank you so much for joining us for this question and answer session related to Sydney Southeast Asia Centre's Politics and Action event for 2020. My guest for this session is Dr. Susan Banki from the University of Sydney. Susan gave a wonderful overview of the current political situation in Myanmar last week. If you haven't had a chance to see that video yet, you can head over to the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre Facebook page or our YouTube channel. Susan, thank you for making some time for us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Great. So I've got a few questions here that were sent in by some of the viewers who saw your video last week. And I'm also interested in getting your perspective on them as well. I'll jump straight in here with our very first question, which reads, I would like to know why there is so much popular support for Daw Suu within Myanmar, and whether the discussions and developments at the international level, such as her appearance at the ICJ, have negatively affected popular perceptions of her, or if in fact they have been effective in bolstering popular support for her.
So this is a question about Aung San Suu Kyi, also known as the Lady or Daw Suu. And the answer to the question I suggested a little bit in my talk, which is it seems to have bolstered support for her within the country. What we see is that there's been condemnation from many international voices outside of Myanmar. But from within Myanmar, what we see is that her embrace of the nationalistic, the defense of the country, seems to have only strengthened her. And this particularly came across in the ICJ, in the International Court of Justice, where she went to The Hague to defend the country because it was quite a public, defiant defense. An article in Nikkei Asian Review actually summarized the current dynamic as follows. The headline of the article was, Aung San Suu Kyi comes out on top in ICJ Rohingya ruling. And the author there was suggesting that not only has this support increased within the country for Aung San Suu Kyi because of this defiant defense that she offered of the country, and that was the word in the article, defiant, but also she has managed to potentially find a way of taming the military, i.e., in defending the military, she has maybe provided herself with the opportunity to gain a bit of a foothold over the military. Now, I think it's too early to say whether that's the case. It's an interesting hypothesis, which could suggest that actually going forward, not only is she stronger among her supporters, but also that she can get a little bit more ability to maintain, increase the civilian control over the military. That would be a very interesting part of the equation.
Thanks, Susan. There's a lot of interest from the international community about the Rohingya situation in Myanmar at the moment. So my next question is along those lines. What do you imagine it will take for the current government regime to change their approach to the Rohingyas within Myanmar?
Much like my talk, my response is rather a pessimistic one. First of all, I'm not sure that we're going to see too much change come from within the government. Where we might see change, I think it's going to come externally. So China has been involved in 3 rounds of talks between the Rohingya and the government, but the results of those we have yet to see the results of any of that. That has not borne fruit. Furthermore, the analysis that's coming off of that is really suggesting that China is not so much interested in the protection of the Rohingya, but really is interested in a stable Myanmar. So what really they're looking for is for there to be just a simple solution that doesn't necessarily take into account what might be of concern for the protection of the Rohingya, nothing about their citizenship, nothing about sort of protecting their ability to have education, rights to travel, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, I just wanted to say I misspoke there. The talks between that China has been involved in has not been between the Rohingya and the government of Myanmar per se. It's been between the government of Bangladesh and the government of Myanmar. Nevertheless, the points that I made about China's involvement and what their interests are the same. There are some small things happening in the edges. There are some groups that are trying to do more smaller kind of attitudinal shifts. There's some civil society within Myanmar groups that are working with both the Rohingya and the Rakhine as a way of trying to kind of increase understanding. And so what we may have to see is some small shifts that way. I will mention one normative shift which has been interesting. I don't want to say that this could necessarily signal change in the country, but quite interestingly, the government of Myanmar, it was either in March or April, did admit, while denying the genocide, did admit that there had likely been violations of humanitarian concerns, of essentially armed conflict. So the Geneva Conventions. So for the government to actually come that far and to confess that there had been violence done to the population, not to the point of genocide, they would argue, but in fact, in the context of armed conflict, there were violations that occurred. One might suggest that could signal a normative shift in the country, an idea that there's been this incorporation of these international standards, because violation of the Geneva Convention is also a violation of international standards. If that kind of language is slowly being adopted in the country, we might see that there's the possibility to signal change, not only on that level of civil society, but maybe internationally. I think it's too early to tell, and that's why I think that my answer to that question is actually rather unsatisfying, and is why I was thinking of not even selecting it as one of the questions to answer, but I thought it was important to do so.
Well, thank you for giving it a go.
Give it a go, yeah.
My next question here is about migrant workers returning to Myanmar from overseas. So the question here is, recently tens of thousands of migrant workers from Myanmar were forced to leave Thailand in a hurry as international borders were shut due to the coronavirus pandemic. They are now placed in quarantine situations with terrible sanitary conditions and also face the risk, an increased risk of contagion with no income or social safety network to support them while they're in quarantine. Could you tell us about the ramifications of the pandemic on migrant workers in the region and how it is impacting their rights and their livelihoods?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's, I think, a very important question. And the question spoke about migrants that return to Myanmar, but if it's okay with you and with the original poster, whose opinion I can't actually get right now, I'd like to actually answer it a little bit more broadly, because while some migrants have returned to Myanmar, the majority have not. So just to back it up for anyone listening, the number of migrants from Myanmar in nearby countries is massive. We know that there's about 1.2 million in Thailand. There's a large number in China as well, and then there are some that are further afield. I'm going to speak mostly about those that have come back from Thailand and those that remain in Thailand. But it's important to know that, the estimates are that 5% of Myanmar's GDP comes from the migrant population. So it's a good question, and there are reasons that we want to ask it. So we believe that about 80,000 migrants have returned to Myanmar since about late March. But since then, Thailand has imposed restrictions on movement, not only at the national level, like across the national borders, but actually within each province, which means actually there are people that want to get home but cannot. So for those who remain, who have been able to return to Myanmar, there have been a range of responses. Now, the questioner suggested that they're in a dire situation, but I do want to say that my reading of the situation has been a little bit more nuanced. So there are quarantine centers being set up in Myawaddy. as well as in Pa'an, which is the capital of Karen State. Karen is the closest geographically. Well, there are many geographic proximities, but many of the migrant workers cross between Myawaddy in Myanmar, which is in Karen State, and the border of Thailand, around the area of Mae Sot. That's one of the big crossing points. So back to the point, in Myawaddy there have been quarantine centers that have been set up, in theory, undergoing testing there, and then many expected to return to their areas and stay within in their respective communities for 21 days. There at least were promises of health screenings and temperature checks at the border in order to have this direction to self-quarantine. One article that I saw mentioned that Karen State has made preparations to place about 5,000 people in quarantine centers, and others were returning to their hometowns in places like Bago and the Magwe regions in Mon State. Now in Mon State, there have been complaints among the population that quarantine facilities being set up in those villages will be problematic because there are no capacity to help those who are going to be in those centers, no way to actually enforce the quarantine measures, and not enough medical support. But this is not to say that all of the migrants returning are in dire need. A few points that I wanted to make is that an article in Frontier Myanmar, which is one of the magazines, English magazines about Myanmar, positively has reviewed the response of the government as compared to, for example, Cyclone Nargis in 2008. We've seen a more compassionate response, the article said, and specifically noted that while the response among migrant workers returning has not been exceptionally good because the government was a little bit was kind of coming off their back foot, logistically, there was certainly, the efforts were being made. And I'm going to talk a little bit in my last question about some of those efforts and what they look like. A UN report has suggested that the agencies that have been working with Myanmar and migrants have continued to function. Some examples is that UN Women is helping with the logistics of managing quarantine centers in Karen State. The ILO is working, the International Labor Organization is working to create materials that are about positively viewing migrant workers return, so that there are attitudinal shifts that are a little bit more positive about their return. So a little bit more about that norm shifting. UNHCR has donated industrial-sized washing machines in Karen State to help with hygiene, and the International Organization of Migration, which is a UN agency, and the government of Japan have been offering supplies and surveillance assistance to keep COVID in check upon the return of migrants. I've seen very little on that, on reports of what's being done to help in Rakhine State, and I will return to that. Now that is my best answer at what is happening to migrants that have returned. But I now want to say that the vast majority of migrants remain in Thailand. They have not come back, and their migrant routes are dealing with an unusual problem. Generally, what they're dealing with is people saying, we want to stay in Thailand, but we want to stay under safe conditions. But what migrant groups are dealing with now is migrants coming to them and saying, we want to get home. Can you help us to get home? Because with Thailand shutting off the borders, both provincial, really mostly provincial, this means that people can't get home. So one article that I read said that there were an expected 15,000 that were expected to return to Myanmar in May, but in fact, by something like May 4th, only 158 had actually crossed across the border because they're stuck. Now, these migrant workers that remain in Thailand are susceptible to the same difficulties that we see with migrant workers throughout Southeast Asia. So first of all, they have poor access to healthcare at a time when they need it the most. There's been a profound loss of jobs in their host countries. In this case, we're talking about Thailand. So migrant workers in construction and in garment factories, in furniture, in plastics, and electronics, and in tourism, they've lost their jobs because of COVID-19. One migrant agency said that at least 5,000 migrants who contacted them are unemployed now. potentially interesting is that in Thailand, one industry that has not suffered is seafood factories. And that is because there is now this massive demand for tinned products like tuna fish. So the seafood factories, by all accounts, seem to be doing okay. Melinda Martinez has written in the Bangkok Post that COVID-19 has also potentially caused the problem of more trafficking, because these are workers that are greatly vulnerable, they are looking for work, and at the same time they're not legally permitted to move. So one can imagine that traffickers can really get in there and get their claws into people that are desperate to get somewhere to potentially get more income. So we need to take a loss. We need to kind of take note of that. Let me also just mention that with the loss of jobs now, many migrants are unable to pay for food or rent, and it's been pointed out that in particular the 70,000 Myanmaris who work in southern Thailand in the tourist industry are at particular risk because of the loss of jobs in the tourism sector, and also because rents are quite high in tourism places. So that's all potentially problematic. I did read that Thailand has offered an emergency stipend to migrants, but I don't believe this is reaching all of them, nor would it be sufficient. What's interesting about all of this is at the same time that migrants want to go home, there's already talk about some of those factories in Thailand opening up again as early as June. So we're not done with this space. We're still going to be seeing movement. We're going to be seeing concerns about what happens when people move, where will quarantine take place, what kind of surveillance is going to take place, and then of course continuing xenophobia against migrants, because they're both the backbone of economies and they are targeted for bringing in problems.
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation about how the coronavirus pandemic is going to affect individual countries in Southeast Asia as well as the region as a whole. And that brings me to my last question here, which is, what has the impact of the coronavirus pandemic been on ethnic and religious tensions in Myanmar? Has it exacerbated them or changed them in any way?
My answer to that is cognitive dissonance. So on the one hand, you have the continuation of peace talks. And in fact, the well-known author and historian Tant Min Oo had a tweet of a picture of the talks. I think it said peace talks in the time of coronavirus or in the time of pandemics. And it's actually this picture of a Zoom call, you know, like gallery view with members of the peace talks, some of them wearing face masks and some of them not, which might suggest that kind of things are moving forward in a positive way. On that kind of positive side, we might say that we might also draw on the fact that the president's office a few weeks ago announced the establishment of a coordinating committee to work with ethnic armed organizations to contain the spread of COVID-19. And there was this no one left behind message embedded in that coordinating committee. And this could, of course, be an opportunity to focus the country and show that concern for the population that was, of course, lacking at the time of COVID lacking at the time of Nargis that I mentioned earlier. An article with Dateline Irrawaddy, the news magazine, with a KNU Central Executive Committee member, suggests that this could be an opportunity to sit at the table. There's even been this discussion about, you know, when there's been trauma in the past, like the tsunami in Aceh, which was kind of a catalyst for peace. One might imagine the same could happen here. And this member that was interviewed really suggested that this is the time for example, the Arakan army to sit at the table. He says in this article, we made so many mistakes, we wasted many years. And now is the time with the ability to come to the table that one could imagine that peace talks could go forward. But on the other hand, we have reports as recently, for example, as 3 days ago from the Lowy Institute of continuing violent attacks against some of the ethnic armed groups, both in Rakhine State and in Chin State. And this idea of no one left behind perhaps rings false when we see some of the other reports going out. For example, there was an article in the New Mandela in late April that reported that the central government was stopping Shan ethnic medical groups from the Restoration Council of Shan states, which is one of the signatories of the National Ceasefire Agreement, from doing medical work. So this is not going to engender trust when some of the ethnic groups on the ground are not actually permitted to do what they want to do. So what I might conclude with on that is that that same historian that I mentioned, Tant Minh Yu, has a post-colonial read of ethnic tension more broadly in Myanmar, which suggests that that inequality sort of embedded and baked into the system in Myanmar since prior to its independence really has the potential to get much worse at this time if we do not see equal treatment with the different ethnic groups at this time of COVID-19. I think ethnic tensions are likely to grow worse. That is potentially more hopeful than how I concluded my last talk, because what I'm saying is there is the possibility with the potential for equal treatment among the ethnic groups when it comes to a response in COVID. Potentially, we could see some changes. We could see potentially that a dog with a crooked tail could straighten it out.
Well, I think that's a nice, hopeful message to end our discussion on, Susan. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer these viewers' questions. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the great questions from the audience out there, whoever you are.
Excellent. And for all of our viewers, if you haven't yet had a chance to watch Susan's video, again, you can head over to the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre's Facebook page and our YouTube channel, and there you will also find country updates from other parts of Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, Laos, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Indonesia, as part of our Politics in Action event, virtual event for 2020. See you there. Bye.